Welcome to Dairy Pod, a podcast series from Dairy Australia. Featuring a range of experts, each episode offers insights into Australia's unique dairy farming conditions, as well as personal experiences and the latest in dairy innovation.
Welcome to Dairy Australia podcast series in minimising the impact of fall armyworm on pastures and crops grown for dairy cattle. In this podcast, we will be discussing a range of potential options to minimise the impact of fall armyworm in the autumn growing season. I am Brenda McLachlan with Dairy Australia, and to discuss fall armyworm, we are pleased to have with us a dairy farmer, an entomologist, and agronomist. So let me introduce you to the actual discussion panel. We have Melvyn Zischke, who is a second-generation dairy farmer operating a Holstein and Jersey herd in a dryland operation north of Oakey on the Darling Downs in Queensland. Melvyn has experienced fall armyworm firsthand and will be sharing the impact of fall armyworm as it has affected his growing oats. Welcome, Melvyn.
Thank you.
Next, on the panel, we have Dr. Melina Miles with us, who is a principal entomologist with the Queensland Department of Primary Industries, also located on the Darling Downs. Melina has been investigating the fall armyworm since its arrival in North Queensland in 2020. She has been following its movement and closely studying its impact, host range, and options for managing this pest. Welcome, Melina.
Oh, thank you, Brenda.
Next, we have Peter Beale, and he is a senior agronomist in extension with the New South Wales Local Land Service. Peter has a wealth of knowledge spanning 40 years, where he has supported both dairy farmers and beef producers in getting the most out of their fodder and helping them minimise pest infestations. Peter is currently based on the mid-north coast at Taree, New South Wales. Welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get started with our discussion. Melvyn, can you give us a brief background of your dairy farm and just the types of pastures and crops that you grow there?
Okay, and then, we dry dairy farm there. We grow oats for the dairy cattle in winter time. Then we grow barley and oats for to make hay. And then any regrowth gets fed to the cattle. And in the summertime, we grow lab, sedan, and forages for the dairy cattle. That's about the main thing that's about the main crops that we grow.
Thanks, Melvyn. What sort of size farm do you have and how many cows?
Oh, roughly milk 120 all year round. But then where we are now, this is probably acres, 640 acres. Then we another 420 next door, where we run the heifers, younger stock, and grow crops for grain and hay. Plus probably 100 so replacement heifers.
Yeah, and do you irrigate or is it all dry land?
No, all dry land in our area.
So, Melvyn, I know that you experienced crop losses last year. Can you let us know about the actual damage and when the crop was affected and for how long it was affected for?
The first planting was planned on the 5th of February, which it was early, but we normally do that every year. And it was up for about 5 or 6 weeks until then we started to notice the crop going white and disappearing. And in a matter of about probably a week, 10 days, it was completely wiped out. And our second planting was planted on about the 20th of February. And the armyworms come in only probably a couple of weeks after that was planted. And within probably a week or so, it's completely wiped that out. And our third planting was about a week later than that. And they did get into that, but I think eventually had some cooler weather and the crop managed to get away from the armyworms, but they still did a reasonable amount of damage. But all the early stuff we planted is more or less 100% wiped out by the armyworms.
Can you tell us, was there any rain fronts or were the plants stressed?
Oh, no, the early crop that we planted first, it was just looking absolutely picture because we had rain after we planted it. And no, it was growing and it was really growing good. It was really healthy and plenty of moisture. And it it was really doing well. Same as the second crop, it was planted with plenty of moisture, but I just disappeared that quick.
And did you notice the fall armyworm in there before it disappeared, or how long before, or was it just taking you by surprise?
Oh, it took us by surprise. Just wonder why it was disappearing so quick. But we did have the forage there in the summertime. There might have been a few in there. We noticed a few leaves have been chewed, but where we planted before we've never experienced anything like this. First time ever.
And over the summer, so you experienced some fall armyworm during summer?
Just probably didn't do any damage. You just see some leaves chewed on the forage and that as other ones are in it, but didn't do any damage at all. But once got into winter crop, just completely wiped it out.
Yeah. And did you notice that last autumn, when you did plant the oats, whether there was an issue then? No,
never the issue planting early oats. We've been planting at that middle of February, probably the last 50 years, and we've never had a problem with it. It's just last year was the first time we ever had a problem with the armyworms. And we've never lost an early oats crop yet in all the years we've been planting early.
Yeah, and you, I believe you planted another crop after the oats, and was it affected? What was that you planted?
Yeah, no, we staggered the plantings from probably February through the May, June, just to say you it's all not ready to feed off at once, and probably once you got into a big month, probably towards April, the pottery plant, then it was right, didn't get affected by the armyworms, got a link to cool where they come down, and that slowed them down.
What was the plants in April that you planted?
It would have been still oats for the dairy cows.
And did you plant barley?
That's right. That gets planted in the middle of April, but that didn't get affected by the armyworms.
Okay, the oats did, but
there's no evidence of the armyworms in the barley. No.
And the armyworms were still around?
By then, they were sort of starting to disappear by then. In our area, they were, but yeah.
Thank you. Can you give some sort of estimate about what's the loss that would have been to your business, and what sort of feeds did you have to use, or was it some other reserves you had on your farm that had to fill that gap?
Because it rained last autumn was fairly wet and it rained fairly often. The summer feed kept going. Regrowth on the summer feed got us through. If it wasn't for that, we would have had a big feed gap. But I say luckily we kept growing, and that kept us feed going. And by the time the third planting got up high enough, we were ready to feed. So we didn't have a feed gap at all, luckily.
Thanks for that information and that background of what happened there, Melvyn. I'd like to now bring in Melina and Peter to discuss options that dairy farmers could look at, in particular if fall armyworm is in their region over summer. First of all, Melina, if I could just ask you, I believe there's limited insecticides available. What management options could be used to minimise the impact of fall armyworm?
Well, I guess the most basic recommendation at this point is to, if at all possible, to delay planting. Melvin's just described how, a couple of months made quite a big difference in terms of the intensity of the fall armyworm infestation. And I think Peter will talk a bit about, what the implications of that practice might be, not for everyone, but that, in a situation where insecticides are not going to be something you can put on if you've got a problem, or there are no effective insecticides, which I think for some regions is the case, then, just putting something in that is not affected by fall armyworm, or delaying planting of susceptible crops until fall armyworm is no longer a real problem in the area is probably the best way to think about how we do things going forward.
Over to you, Peter. What's your thoughts on agronomic type of practices or management practices?
Yeah.
Fall armyworm is likely to be in your area, taking into account the actual risk.
Look, I think we're all learning in this space, and there'll be different strategies that work differently in different years. I think we have to look back over a bigger picture that we've had fall armyworm for 4 years, and last year was particularly bad and really did devastate a number of dairy farms where they lost their first grazing. But I'd have to say that wasn't all the paddocks. There was, probably 80% of the dairy farms in this region didn't suffer catastrophic damage. So you have to take that into account. And obviously, if you've got a high population that's there, then delaying planting is a very real option because you're just going to lose what you sow. But in many cases, if you do thorough inspecting and you don't find pests there, then delaying is a deliberate decision to lose, that early autumn feed, and that's the quality feed coming on. So I'd be reluctant to delay all sowings, but I'd certainly be trying to assess, have I got fall armyworm and is it fall armyworm? Because we do see very mixed populations. There are some fields last year that were just the normal armyworm, and they can be treated. So that's really what I'd be looking at first. And as Melina suggested, looking at either including other species like chicory or some of the turnips may not be, leafy turnips may not be as attractive. And certainly one of the paddocks last year had a lot of chicory in it. Although it was affected, it did come back quicker. And we also have, particularly in our situation where we're growing a lot of maize or forage sorghum for silage, that rather than oats, which is quite attractive, we do have an option to look at winter wheat, and there is a permit for a product that, well, it's not perfect, but it does mean it's available for that real salvage situation. And again, I think just really assessing what your risk in the paddock. We can have fall armyworms, and we did last year in some paddocks that were there, but the conditions were favouring the crop growth. The numbers were not, alarmingly high, and they just didn't need spraying. So there's a few things to consider there, and I'm sure Melina's got some other ideas too.
Do you think it's worth, Peter, just talking a little bit about risk and how we might assess risk? What are the sort of things, and maybe I can just talk about fall armyworm and what things you might look at in terms of making an assessment. And I guess one of the really big indicators is probably just how much of a problem fall armyworm has been in the previous summer. And last year, when we got to January, February, we were seeing fall armyworm activity in maize and sorghum at levels that we hadn't seen before. And, I guess now we would see that as a really good indicator of what is likely to happen in autumn plantings, whereas up until last year, we hadn't had that experience. The other thing that I would mention is that, there are now quite a lot of pheromone traps around in different regions. And whether they be the automated rapid aim traps or just the manual pot traps. And certainly they give you a good idea. So this summer, we've seen very low fall armyworm activity, and the traps are indicating that with, just a few moths per night or even per week. Whereas last year we were seeing several hundred, if not, into the thousands of moths over a week. So those sorts of indicators are sort of, on a landscape scale, tell you something about whether it's going to be a horrendous year or not so horrendous. But once you're sort of talking about your own particular farm, then, Peter's kind of mentioned, checking to see whether fall armyworm is actually there. And, there's no substitute for getting into the paddock and having a look when the plants are small, on your hands and knees to see whether there's any evidence of early feeding by caterpillars. If you've got a thick pasture, then something like a beat sheet is a really handy way to get across a lot of area and just have a quick look to see what you're getting in your net and whether it's, fall armyworm, is it native armyworm, is it nothing at all? So I think that, whilst these practices might not have been common practice for dairy farmers and for their advisors, now we have fall armyworm in the system. I think that they are really important things that people should be doing routinely to be able to make decisions about what the risk is and whether they can just go ahead and plant as they might usually plant early, or give some thought to the sort of things that Peter was talking about.
Yeah, no, they're all really good points, Melina, and assessing risks, and just reflecting that we were actually getting damage right into May last year in oats that were sown in April. So to try and delay completely is to that right down to May would be really quite a loss in terms of your autumn feed production. But I think it's going to be a skill we're going to need to get to assess, particularly before sowing, because in that first week or 10 days after sowing of ryegrass or oats, they are very susceptible, and even the winter wheat in that period, the product that's available needs to have contact with the plant, so you've got to have enough of a plant there to control. And in the past, there were the traditional thing here was to do a pre-planting spray when there's a lot of armyworm in the kikuyu. Whereas we did see fall armyworm damage, 5 and 6 weeks later, which really wouldn't be effective. So that's another point. Just you can't think you're going to spray it and walk away. It could be a problem, for that first 4 or 5 weeks.
I think it might be worth just talking about spraying. I mean, we've said it. Brenda started off by saying, the options are very limited and perhaps not particularly effective. And I think it's important just to really stress that if fall armyworm is your primary issue, then in Queensland, that each state has its own legislative situation. Certainly in Queensland, you can't use products that are not registered for that particular pest. In New South Wales, you can use them if they're registered in that crop. So in New South Wales, for example, if you might typically use Trojan or Lanate to control your caterpillar pests in your pasture or your crops, you need to be aware that fall armyworm is much less susceptible, if at all susceptible, to both those products. So fall armyworm has arrived in Australia with very high resistance to synthetic pyrethroids like Trojan, and moderately resistant to carbamates, things like Lanate, and organophosphates, things like Lawsban. So what would happen if you targeted a fairly high population of fall armyworm that was going to cause total crop loss with a methamil or a Lanate? I guess the problem is that you just don't know. Are you going to get 70% control, or are you going to get very little control? If you put on a Trojan, you're likely to get 10% control. So that's why those products are not recommended for fall armyworm. So that's, I guess that's sort of really difficult situation when it comes to pulling up a population that's damaging your crop, is why we're having this discussion about, what other options are there for filling that feed gap when fall armyworm might still be, quite a considerable threat to something like oats.
Yeah, no, they're very valid points. And I do know that farmers last year did try with some of those products and really had no impact. So and the label recommendations, even though it is legal to use Lanate or methamol, it's very restrictive. And as you say, in a population that is causing the sort of damage we've seen, that most of the larvae are just way too big, and you're really not going to have any effect. So it's although it sounds hopeful, I think we are in that situation where we really need products that are suitable, and we are trying to progress applications to the APVMA for other products that are used in other crops but are just not registered at this point. So that's the process we're working through.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth just mentioning, you did mention that with winter wheat, there is a permit for control of fall armyworm in winter wheat, and that's for emamectin benzoate or a firm or warlock. Now, that is a very effective product, can't be put on bare earth, as you said, has to go on the plant, will be effective against larvae that are, a reasonable size, which is, I guess, typically, if you're caught unawares, it's because you've got very big larvae causing a lot of damage. But I think, unlike something like Lanate, a firm or warlock has a relatively long withholding period. So, in systems where it's up to 6 weeks. So, you just need to be aware in a system where you're using insecticides and grazing or cutting for hay that you are, so compliant with those withholding periods. And, that itself is can be quite a big challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, and that firm would be useful in the first 3 weeks, but beyond that, you're running into serious withholding period problems.
Yeah, we were told there was nothing we could do with our armyworm. You just have to sit back and let them eat the crop. There's nothing we can do with it. But
That's right. So oats and barley fall into a different sort of cereal category. So that's why wheat, you have an option, but oats and barley need a little bit more work to sort of get the MRLs for those crops. So that's an unfortunate sort of situation. The most susceptible one for the ones that we don't have any options.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, a question for either Melina or Peter there. If there is fall armyworm, when it is actually in the crop, is there an opportunity to actually graze it to reduce the actual numbers if it's a possibility or the time is right to graze it? What do you think of that?
I don't think it's a question of, reducing numbers. I think it is if you are monitoring and you see, because quite often they'll start on the side of the crop, or at least the older common armyworm does. So, and it come in patches and it grows. So if you see a particular paddock that's ready to graze and there's starting to be infested, and you graze it off, then you've got that grazing, producing milk, rather than having to wait for the catastrophe and then resow and then wait to come back. So it's really a salvage thing to, Melina would know better than me if it reduces numbers, but I don't think that's the issue at the time.
No. And I guess, did you want to say something, Mel?
No, you're right. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, I guess the other thing about assessing risk and awareness is if you're in a situation where you do have to resow, particularly if you're resowing back especially if you're resowing back into the pasture or the crop where you have had a problem, unless it's highly likely if you do that within a couple of weeks that there will be large and very damaging fall armyworms still in that paddock. So, certainly that on the inner downs last year, that was the situation where people weren't sure why their crop had failed and disappeared. Was it moisture? Was it poor seed? And so they were sowing back into the areas. And as Melvyn sort of described, the crop was disappearing faster than it's because the caterpillars were, much bigger and more voracious.
I think we planned our second planting probably about 2 months later, straight into it, and then it was okay. Yes. Well, then we had the cooler weather.
Yeah, so certainly in February, fall armyworm, for the time it hatches from the egg until the time it finishes feeding, maybe as long as 2 weeks. And that certainly gets longer as the nights get cooler and the days get cooler.
Yeah.
And eventually the population just sort of peters out.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Melina, there is a question I've been asked you might comment on, is that the seed dressings, do they have any activity or will they be of benefit?
Well, the seed dressings are typically neonicotinoid seed treatments, and our experience, we've done some glasshouse trials to see if even small larvae would be controlled, and they very happily feed on them. And I think as evidenced by the impact of fall armyworm on things like sorghums, forage sorghum, maize for silage, they nearly all come treated with something like Cruiser, which is one of those neonic seed treatments, and that provides no protection whatsoever.
And what about palatability of the various brassicas and to fall armyworm? Will they be a deterrent or?
Yeah, so brassicas are not one of the things that we have seen fall armyworm in a big way. So brassicas and legumes seem to be relatively unaffected. You can get moths making a mistake and maybe some larvae, but we tend not to get the population, at damaging levels. In brassicas, I have seen sort of low-level infestations, which makes, you can visually see holes in the leaves. But, the crop is, again, it's sort of a crop that will outgrow damage from a population of fall armyworm that's actually, growing and feeding quite slowly in the cooler conditions. Certainly legumes and brassicas we wouldn't see as being as high risk. Certainly there would be situations where they could be quite severely damaged. Say if you're planting them into a pasture that has fall armyworm in it, or you're planting them into a weedy fallow or something like that, where it brings in little seedlings in close contact with damaging larvae, you can still get quite considerable losses of seedlings as they establish. But, when a crop is well established and growing well and then gets an infestation of fall armyworm from moths laying eggs, I'm not aware that there's been any significant losses in that situation.
Yeah, there was some quite interesting research done with Sydney University and the Future Dairy where they sowed specifically, forage crops of brassicas and then sowed ryegrass later. So it is an option to consider to delay your ryegrass planting but put a high density of brassicas. It really suits that situation after maize where there's nothing else growing. Doesn't tend to fit the Ikea sowings, but that is, it's something we should be looking at or seeing where that fits.
Yeah, and to my mind, that's a much lower risk strategy than something like a mixed planting of ryegrass and something like oats, or where the oats provide an opportunity for fall armyworm to lay eggs and for larvae to grow and then move on to the ryegrass. I think that mixed plantings of things that are very attractive to fall armyworm increase the complexity of trying to manage an infestation and protect, your longer term option like ryegrass that's in there with them. I don't know if you want to say something more about that, Peter.
Well, it is something that a number of growers know who did have maize silage last year. There was a bit of grain which germinated. They had volunteers, and that fall armyworm did seem to be attracted to them. And it varied, but there were some people saying that they took to the maize and didn't touch the ryegrass. But I don't know that. And we have a couple of farmers who'll be looking at doing that sort of thing. But it's not something I can be assured of just yet. There's also talk about bait crops where you sow some maize to the side as an attractant, and I think you talked about that being done overseas. To me, that's probably a good thing to be able to identify. Do you have fall armyworm, and use them as a track crop too? But we're perhaps a little bit late for that at this point in time.
I have some hesitation about those strategies just because, it's another thing to manage. It takes your attention, and if you get it wrong, you potentially got a big population of fall armyworm that's sort of finished feeding on the maize and looking for somewhere else to go. Maybe in time those options are better. I think at this point we're still kind of learning, how you protect your primary sort of pastures and so on. That's a bit of maybe a stretch goal.
Yeah. Just a question without notice. If you are growing maize silage, is there a greater potential for, if you missed your last spray or you didn't think you need them, but there's pupae in the ground, so you expect a higher population of coming out of the maize?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that, there's quite good evidence from overseas that fall armyworm female moths, when they emerge from the ground at the end of that pupation in the soil, that they are more inclined to lay close to where they emerge if there's something suitable. If there's nothing suitable, they'll sort of get on the wing and move off looking for something. But that's, I guess, why we tend to see populations build up in a crop like maize, get an early infestation. And then, if that's not well controlled or not controlled at all, then the next generation is even bigger and away you go. So, I think absolutely you can generate your own populations and increase the risk that way.
Yep. And just another species to consider too, again, going back to the future dairy work, they use field peas at some point, which being a legume may be something we should consider as a, short-term break crop, if you like. Yes, and so the ryegrass later.
Yeah, so without dryland farming, ryegrass is ruled out. You've got to have plenty of water for ryegrass. Yeah, so that's not an option for dryland farming.
Yep.
The ryegrass, yes. I thought repeat our oats early because sometimes it doesn't rain in March season. That's where you get your early oats, and that's where you normally get your good food.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just for that, you got the rainfall early, you just plant, and normally rains. Yes, last year was it? And
every region's just a bit different, isn't it?
yes, yeah, that's right.
Melvyn, would winter wheat work for you or for other farmers? Have you heard of other farmers growing winter wheat?
Probably would be an option. Or no, didn't know. One farmer did grow some winter wheat. He was quite impressed with it. But he wasn't growing just for sake of money for armyworms. He was just growing just for feed. He was quite happy with it.
Was that in that early planting window?
Would have been probably early penguin now, yes. You get a couple of crops off of it, probably just to try something different from oats. But so it probably is an option if you want to try it. Yeah. Whether you're planting in February or not, I don't know. It might be too early for wheat in February.
No, but I mean, that's one of the beauties of winter wheat that they have a fertilisation requirement, so they won't go up to head until you get that. Although, going further north, your varieties are going to be important, but you can basically sow them from February through to May. Yeah. So that's a big advantage. And there's quite a number of growers using them. We did have problems with stripe rust with one particular variety a few years ago. So, you have to look at what you're doing at the end, whether they're bearded versus unbearded varieties.
Right.
Yeah. But it certainly is an option down here that a number of farmers are using to, for that early sowing.
Melina, is there any weather events that might help out with the fall armyworm?
Cold weather's great. It slows them down. There was a lot of last year when, we were just so keen to see the end of the fall armyworm pressure in the winter crops. There was a lot of optimism that the first frost would put an end to it. But, these things can tolerate some frost, particularly if it's, the sort of frost we get here is, nowhere near cold enough to kill them dead.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So it's really, once you're into that sort of March, April, May period, it really is just an attrition of the remaining fall armyworm. They don't do well under cold conditions. They're growing very slowly. All sorts of predators can pick them off. And the population just sort of gets whittled away. But, certainly temperature is probably the biggest factor. Everything happens very fast when it's warm and much more slowly when it's cooler.
What about heavy rainfall?
Yeah, well, what we see with heavy rain is that it tends to stop the female moths from laying, so you can get a lull in egg pressure. We see that in our, our crop trials. It also, we expect that it probably plays a really important role in knocking small larvae off the plants. We get very few surviving larvae from hundreds and hundreds of eggs. So there are all sorts of things that can affect the survival of small larvae. But once you've got a larva that's about, sort of 10 millimetres in length, their chances of survival are very, very high. And the bigger they are, the more likely they are to survive. So, the natural attrition of small larvae is extremely high from things like wind and rain and, natural enemies and so on. But, rain probably the biggest effect would be on small larvae and moths.
Mm. And what do you suggest about checking paddocks for dairy farmers? What would you suggest?
Oh, I suggest that it's something that you do, that it becomes part of what you do, and that what you're looking for. I guess if you're not sure what fall armyworm looks like and how to distinguish it from native armyworms, and that would be something that would be pretty important. And it's also possible that there'll be other things in there that have little consequence. So separating them from fall armyworm is quite important. And I guess, when I say things happen really quickly, it's still a week or two, at least a week before you get from an egg to a larva that's going to cause a lot of damage in your crop. So weekly sampling is probably a good place to start, and it could even be fortnightly as we go further south where things are cooler and happening more slowly.
Once you find the egg, then where do you find them?
Well, it's really challenging because you've got little plants and that the moths tend to lay their eggs under the leaves. Oh. So, it really is a matter of pulling up plants and looking on the bottom leaves to see if you can see those little white fluffy egg masses. So, they don't make it easy.
Yeah, right.
So,
what about the sweep net, Melina?
Yeah, look, I think the sweep net's not a good tool for a really tiny crop because you have to have something to hit. But certainly, I think and same for native armyworms. It's really useful. You can cover a lot of ground, swing it in front of you while you're looking for weeds or anything else, and then everything's caught, so you can then just have a look in the net to see what's there. And I think I mentioned before that I see it as a really useful tool for, where you might be looking to put something that's susceptible to fall armyworm or even the other native armyworms into a standing something that's already there, like a kikuyu pasture or something. It gives you the opportunity to have a quick look to see if there's anything there already.
Yeah. Mm.
Oh, thank you for all that information. We're getting near the end of the podcast, so I'd like to have some summary or summarise at the moment. Melina, what sort of key options overall would you recommend for farmers to minimise the fall armyworm?
Well, I think that, assessing risk each season and for your area is absolutely critical. I think that, fall armyworm, for those who've had a really difficult experience with it, like Melvyn has, you could sort of think that, hey, here's a really problematic pest that we're going to have to spray every year. But certainly, Melvyn's experience sort of illustrates that it's been here 5 years and this is the first year it's had a problem. So if it's a 1 in 5, you really want to know which one of those years is going to be the one. So assessing risk, I'm not sure what how dairy would be able to communicate information about the activity of fall armyworm as we get into autumn. But certainly I think that's the number one thing. And making sure that, pasture that doesn't establish is kind of investigated with fall armyworm front of mind rather than, just assuming that something else has gone wrong. But yeah, look, insect management, a new thing for graziers and dairy farmers. So it's just something new that has to be incorporated into what you or your advisor does.
Since we asked the question, what's going to happen next year? And then got on and said, I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah, and we have identification charts there, Melina, with the DPI website and also Dairy Australia. So it's the beatsheet.com.au.
Yes, and I think you've got to put links or something, Brenda, that people can get access to. So there are lots of resources there for identifying fall armyworm and so on.
Yes, that's a good suggestion. Peter, in summary, what are some key options from an agronomic management point of view, in your opinion?
Yep, I agree with Melina. It's surveillance and risk assessment, just really weigh up your individual situation and what your options are, because they'll be different for a kikuyu sowing to a host silage, maize silage. And share your risk. So don't sow everything to one species. Try the winter wheat where it's appropriate. And some of these other species, the chicory, I'd certainly be putting chicory in. And there are other clovers too, shaft or clover. Some people are using that. One thing that we haven't talked about is just have a fodder source on hand so you're not caught out. That, most people do have silage but if your reserves are low and you're not normally feeding a lot at this time of year, just be ready to switch feeds if you have to. So that's just the risk management thing. And I think delaying sowing has a place. But really, I think if I'd be just really looking at the numbers of armyworm, what sort of damage they're doing. We didn't mention dry conditions, that if things are dry, you're going to get more, the plants are growing slower and you'll get more effect out of the insects. If we get really good moist conditions and they're growing well there, then they can often outstrip and the actual damage. So things like that are just really trying to assess that risk and get good information on whether you do need to spray or graze early or some of that will re-sow, those things.
Well, this wraps up the podcast, and I would like to thank Melvyn, Peter and Melina for their time, expertise and insights. And this discussion will give dairy farmers some options that they could consider in reducing the impact of fall armyworm on their farm. Thank you.
Thank you for joining today's Dairy Pod episode. We hope you found it enjoyable and insightful. For more information, check out the episode notes. You can stay up to date by following Dairy Pod on your favourite podcast platform. To get in touch, visit dairyaustralia.com.au. Until next time, take care.